The assembly bell rang before the sun had fully cleared the hills east of the city. It was a sound Athens had made for generations, a bronze instruction, a civic reflex, and in the weeks following the democratic restoration of 403 BCE, the citizens who heard it and rose and made their way through the narrow streets toward the assembly did so with a particular quality of obedience that was not quite the same as belief. The harbor smell was still in the air that morning, salt and pitch and something faintly burning. The agora lay between the bell and the assembly, and the men who crossed it in those early hours moved through a space that was just beginning its daily transformation from empty stone to the particular organized chaos of a city that had not yet decided what it was. The stalls were coming open. A fishmonger was arranging his catch on a low stone shelf, the silver and gray bodies catching the young light. An olive merchant was measuring oil into ceramic vessels with a focused, unhurried precision that suggested he had done this 10,000 times and found in it, if not contentment, at least a kind of rhythmic peace. The smoke from a sacrifice being conducted near the Stoa of Zeus drifted across the square in a thin, pale thread, rising and dispersing before it reached the colonnades on the far side. The agora at this hour had the quality of a stage before any of the actors had decided what the play was. All the props in place, the light arriving, the first few figures moving through it, without yet performing anything for anyone. And already, in this cool and only partly populated morning, there was a barefoot man in a plain cloak standing near a craftsman's stall, not to buy anything, talking. This is where Athens in 399 BCE begins to make sense. Not in the assembly, not in the courts, not in the grand architecture of the Acropolis, visible above the city like a statement of an older certainty. It begins here, in this ordinary square, on an ordinary morning, where a man who owned almost nothing and sold nothing was already, before the day had properly arrived, asking questions that the people who tried to answer them would spend the rest of their lives turning over. That man was Socrates. He was already old. He had been having these conversations for decades, and the city around him had changed enormously in that time, and he had changed almost not at all. The city, though, had been through something that leaves a particular kind of mark. It is the kind of mark that does not look like damage from the outside, because the people who carry it have made a collective decision to carry it quietly. The Peloponnesian War had ended in 404 BCE, after more than 25 years. The defeat was not merely a military event. Athens had entered that war as something, a city that had convinced itself its power was a form of virtue, that its empire was a gift to the world it was extracting tribute from, that its democratic confidence and its Periclean grandeur amounted to a kind of civilization that history had been working toward. The historian Thucydides, who lived through it, recorded not just the battles, but the slow unwinding of that conviction. He watched the Athenians make decision after decision that could only be made by a city that had mistaken its own appetite for wisdom. The Sicilian expedition, launched in 415 BCE, with the largest fleet Athens had ever assembled, aimed at conquering an island they barely understood, driven by a confidence that Thucydides understood as a form of collective blindness, ended in the near total destruction of that fleet and the deaths of tens of thousands. The war continued anyway, for over a decade more, until there was nothing left to continue with. The long walls were torn down. The fleet was surrendered. Sparta's allies danced in the streets at the news of Athens' fall. What came after the defeat was, in some ways, worse than the defeat itself. A regime of 30 oligarchs, backed by Spartan authority, seized control of Athens in 404 BCE and conducted a brief, brutal tyranny that resulted in the execution of some 1,500 citizens and the exile of many more. The 30 were led by Critias, who had once been a student of Socrates, and they governed through a combination of ideological ferocity and simple terror that left permanent scars on the city's memory of what power without democratic constraint could become. The democratic restoration that overthrew the 30 in 403 BCE was therefore experienced not merely as a political event, but as something more urgent, the return of the city to a version of itself it had not been sure it would ever recover. The amnesty that accompanied the restoration was a remarkable legal construction. It forbade any citizen from bringing legal action against any other citizen for crimes committed during the period of the 30's rule. It was a legislated silence, a formal instruction to a wounded community to stop speaking about its wounds in certain public registers and to begin the work of civil life again as though the wound had already healed. The men who passed this law were not naive about what they were doing. They understood that without it, the restored democracy might collapse immediately into cycles of retribution and counter-retribution that would undo everything they had fought to reclaim. The amnesty was a rational response to an impossible situation, and it was also necessarily a form of injustice. The families of those executed by the 30 had no legal remedy. The men who had informed on their neighbors, who had watched their colleagues dragged away, who had survived by keeping a very careful silence during the months of terror, none of them could be named in court, charged, or answered. A citizen of Athens in the early weeks of 403 BCE, sitting in the restored assembly and watching the ordinary business of democracy resume, the debates, the votes, the procedural motions, the officials reporting their accounts, carried something in his chest that had no public outlet. The grief was real, the anger was real, the specific memory of specific faces was real, and the law said, with a precision that made it both protective and terrible, none of this can be brought here. None of this can be argued. The assembly is open. The courts are open. The agora is open. Say whatever you like about any matter that falls within the proper scope of civic discourse. Only do not say this. Only do not name what happened when the city was briefly something it never wanted to be. This was the air of Athens in 403 BCE, and it did not change dramatically in the 4 years that followed. The city went about its business with the particular determination of a community that has decided the only way forward is forward. New alliances were negotiated. The courts resumed their normal function. The religious festivals returned to their proper calendar, the processions moving through the streets on schedule, the sacrifices performed at the appointed altars, the city presenting itself to its gods in the official language of continuity and gratitude. From a distance, or from the vantage point of a later history that knows how Athens eventually recovered and what its legacy became, the city in these years might look almost ordinary. From the inside, the people living in it knew that something had been placed under the surface of ordinary life that was not yet resolved and might not be resolved for a long time. Into this particular atmosphere, the agora functioned as more than a marketplace. It had always been the beating center of Athenian civic life, the place where trade and politics and religion and gossip and philosophy all occurred in the same space at the same time, where a man who wanted to buy a new cloak might find himself overhearing a legal dispute, or pass a group of young men engaged in an argument about whether courage was a form of knowledge. The colonnades that bordered the open square, the Stoa Poikile to the north, with its painted murals of the Persian Wars, the smaller stoas along the other edges, offering shade and a surface to lean against, created a kind of informal architecture of conversation. People drifted from one exchange to another. Arguments began and were abandoned, and were picked up again by different people hours later. The agora was, among other things, a kind of distributed, uncoordinated forum where the city thought out loud in 100 simultaneous conversations. This was not merely the backdrop for Socrates' philosophical practice, it was the condition that made it possible. The method Socrates used depended entirely on the encounter, the spontaneous meeting with a citizen who had come to the agora for some ordinary purpose, and who, in the ordinary confidence of an adult in the possession of his own views, believed himself to know something, to know what justice was, or what piety required, or what courage actually consisted of, when you examined it carefully. These were not unusual beliefs. A general who had won battles had obvious reason to believe he understood courage. A priest who had performed sacrifices his whole life had obvious reason to believe he understood what the gods required. A statesman who had governed the city through difficult years had obvious reason to believe he understood justice. Socrates was genuinely curious about all of them. This is perhaps the detail that is easiest to misplace when reconstructing his character at this historical distance, that the curiosity was real, not performative, not a pedagogical strategy deployed with a predetermined conclusion already in mind. He wanted to know. He had been told, through channels he took seriously and did not entirely understand, that he was somehow the wisest man in Athens, and this had struck him as obviously false, and he had gone into the agora to disprove it, and what he had found instead, over decades of asking, was that the knowledge he kept encountering was not quite knowledge at all, and that this discovery, which left his interlocutors confused and often angry, left him not exactly happy, but committed to continuing. The agora on an ordinary morning in 400 BCE was the place where this commitment found its daily expression. A man who came to buy fish and found himself, 20 minutes later, standing with his fish still in his hands and trying with visible difficulty to define what justice meant. This was not an unusual figure in the Athens of this period. The fishmonger had been perfectly clear about justice when the conversation began. He had given an answer that seemed to him, and perhaps would seem to most people, entirely adequate. Justice is giving to each person what they are owed. Socrates had asked, in his quiet and unhurried way, whether this was always the case, whether it would be just to return a borrowed sword to a man who had since gone mad. The fishmonger, or the general, or the poet, or whoever was standing in that particular spot of morning light, with that particular confidence about that particular concept, would begin the work of revising his answer, and then revising it again. And by the time the conversation had gone on long enough, he would arrive at a place he had not expected to reach, unable to define what he had, 20 minutes earlier, assumed he knew. What he did with that experience after the conversation ended was his own business. Some people, particularly the young, found it exhilarating, the discovery of genuine uncertainty after a life of comfortable assumption, the invitation to think more carefully, the sense that the questions were more interesting than they had appeared. Others, particularly those whose social standing rested in part on the assumption of their own expertise, found it something considerably less welcome. A general who could not define courage after 30 years of military command. A priest who could not define piety after a lifetime at the altar. The experience of being exposed in this way, and in public, in the middle of the agora, where anyone passing might notice, accumulated. It accumulated over years. It accumulated in the memory of the city. This is worth sitting with because it explains something about the texture of Athens in the years immediately before the trial. The resentment of Socrates that he himself described in his own defense was not new, was not the sudden product of a single political crisis or a particular accusation. It was old. It had been building for decades in the specific way that public embarrassment builds. Not dramatically, not with any single explosive event, but gradually in the private conversations of men who had been made to look foolish and had gone home and found that the discomfort did not simply dissolve. But there is another layer to this, deeper and more structural, that has to do not with personal resentment, but with the specific civic meaning of religion in Athens. The gods of the Athenian polis were not private matters, they were public ones. The religious calendar was the civic calendar, the festivals of Athena, the rites of Demeter, the processions and sacrifices, and public prayers that organized the city's year, were also the occasions through which the community expressed its relationship to the divine protection it depended on. When an Athenian performed his civic religious duties, when he participated in the correct way, at the correct time, in the correct rituals, he was doing something that had meaning not only for his own soul, but for the entire communities standing with the gods who protected the city. Impiety, in this context, was not merely a personal failing or a private theological error. It was a civic danger, a man who introduced strange divine beings, or who failed to acknowledge the gods the city acknowledged, or who corrupted the young men of the city in their religious understanding, was a man who potentially damaged the relationship between Athens and its divine protectors. The gods might withdraw their favor, the sacrifices might become unacceptable, the city might find itself exposed in some fundamental way that all the walls and ships and armies could not address. This is not superstition in the simple dismissive sense. It is the logic of a religious world in which the boundary between public and private, between the individual's theological opinions and the community's collective standing before the divine, was drawn very differently from where most people in later centuries would draw it. Socrates' religious habits were unusual. The daimonion, the personal divine sign he described as an internal voice that restrained him from certain actions, was a genuinely odd thing by Athenian standards. It was private in a context where religion was public. It was individual in a context where the gods were held in common. Whether or not anyone had formally noted this as dangerous in the years before 399 BCE, the strangeness of it was available to be noted, and in a city already sensitive about its relationship to divine protection, the strangeness carried a weight it might not have carried in more settled times. The Parthenon was visible from the agora's edge, standing on the Acropolis above the city in the morning light. It was intact then. The gold and ivory statue of Athena that Phidias had made stood in its interior, in the interior darkness, enormous and still. The temple had been built during the height of Periclean confidence, the particular moment in the mid-5th century when Athens had convinced itself and many others that its democratic power and its cultural achievement were the same thing, that the city's greatness was a form of goodness, that the empire sustained by tribute from dozens of subject states was the expression of an enlightened civilization rather than the expression of overwhelming naval force. The temple embodied that conviction in marble and gold. It had been built with money that had, in part, been diverted from the treasury of the Delian League, money contributed by allied states for their collective defense, redirected into Athenian grandeur by a democracy that had managed to believe, or at least to argue, that making Athens beautiful was a gift to all of Greece. The Parthenon still stood in 400 BCE. It still gleamed, it was still magnificent, and it stood above a city that had lost the war, lost the empire, lost the long walls, lost the fleet, lived through the tyranny of the 30, survived the democratic restoration, and was now in the difficult and specific position of a community trying to hold itself together across a very large set of unhealed disagreements about what had happened and who was responsible. The men who passed each other in the narrow streets of Athens in these years, a restored democrat and a man who had collaborated with the oligarchs, recognizing each other, nodding with a careful, neutral acknowledgement that was the practiced expression of the amnesty they were both living under. These men were not pretending nothing had happened. They both knew what had happened. They both knew that the other knew. The nod was the performance of a decision they had collectively made through their democratic process that to continue the community was worth more than to settle every account. It was a reasonable decision. It was also a specific kind of daily effort, and the effort had a weight that pressed on the city's mood in ways that were not always visible, but were always present. In this world, intellectual nonconformity was not simply eccentric. The restored democracy was in the business of closing ranks around shared values, the traditional gods, the traditional civic practices, the traditional understanding of what it meant to be a proper Athenian citizen, because shared values were the mechanism through which the community was attempting to hold itself together. A man who associated with students who went on to become tyrants and traitors, who introduced strange divine signs, who spent decades publicly embarrassing the city's most respected citizens by exposing the uncertainty beneath their confident expertise, who did all of this cheerfully and without apparent concern for how it looked. This man was not merely eccentric in a city that had decided eccentricity was an unaffordable luxury. He was, by the specific logic of the civic moment, something more complicated. This is not to say that the trial of 399 BCE was inevitable in a simple mechanical sense. History does not work that way, and the particular sequence of events that produced the indictment had its own local causes and its own particular actors making particular choices. But the conditions that made the trial possible, that allowed 3 accusers to stand before 500 citizens and have their accusations understood as plausible, as politically and religiously serious, as matters of genuine civic concern, rather than personal grudge. These conditions had been building for a long time. They were built into the specific wound of the defeat and the amnesty that tried to close it without quite healing it. They were built into the civic meaning of religion in a city that needed its gods to be properly honored. They were built into the social experience of decades of public conversations that had left a steady accumulation of privately felt resentments in the minds of men who had been made to feel, in the middle of the city's most public space, that they did not know what they thought they knew. The agora in the late afternoon was a different place than the agora at dawn. The crowd thinned as the day progressed toward dusk. The fishmonger folded his stall. The oil merchant stoppered his vessels and counted his transactions. The sacrifice smoke near the stoa had long since dissipated. The colonnades, which had been busy with conversations and transactions and arguments since mid-morning, fell gradually into their own long shadows as the light shifted from overhead to oblique, from bright to golden, and then began, slowly, to leave. A few figures remained, a group of young men in philosophical argument near the south stoa, their voices carrying in the quieter air, not quite close enough to hear clearly. A slave sweeping the stone pavement near the monument to the tribal heroes, the sound of the broom, a slow rhythmic percussion against the deepening quiet. The Parthenon, above and to the south, caught the late light and held it a little longer than anything around it, the marble warming to a color that was almost amber in the long hour before sunset, still and enormous against the fading sky. From the agora's edge, looking up at it from where the colonnades gave way to open ground, a person could see simultaneously what Athens had believed about itself, when it built that building and what Athens was now. The temple intact and beautiful, the civic confidence that had raised it substantially less so, the city continuing in the complicated, effortful way that cities continue when they have been through something they have not entirely survived. The questions that Socrates had been asking in this square on hundreds of mornings before this one, and on many that would follow, had a particular quality in this particular city at this particular moment. They were questions that in more settled times might have remained simply philosophical, interesting, provocative to their immediate audience, belonging to the open category of things that educated Athenians discussed. In a city trying to hold itself together through enforced silence about what it had survived, in a city where the shared religious life was one of the primary mechanisms of civic solidarity, in a city where the associations of one unusual philosopher included men who had collaborated with tyranny. In this city, at this moment, the same questions landed differently. They landed in a place that was already tender, already sensitive, already inclined to experience disruption as something more than inconvenience. This is not a story about a misunderstanding or a mob. It is a story about a mind and a city that were in some fundamental sense not compatible, not because either was simply wrong, but because the city was trying to do something, the work of survival and cohesion that Socrates' habit of mind made consistently and constitutively harder. The city needed to settle certain questions in order to continue. Socrates had spent his life demonstrating that the questions were not settled and could not be settled by the methods the city was using to settle them. The last light left the agora. The colonnade stood empty and cooling in the early evening air. The Parthenon on its hill held the final color of the day a little longer, and then let it go. The city was quiet in the way that cities are quiet at the edge of darkness, not silent, but gathered in, the noise of the day folding back into the 1,000 private spaces, the households and the workshops and the small back rooms where it would rest until morning. Somewhere in the city, a man who had spent the day in conversation was making his slow way home through the narrow streets, still thinking about the conversation, still following whatever thread it had put in his hands, without urgency and without the particular concern for what the city was making of him that most men in his position would have found impossible to avoid. The world in which Socrates had chosen to spend his life was one that had become, through no single decision and no single event, increasingly disposed to hear his questions as something other than questions. This was not a sudden change. It had happened gradually, the way most irreversible changes happen, through the slow accumulation of experience, through the specific historical pressures of a particular city at a particular moment, through the steady building of conditions that no one had quite intended and no one could quite undo. The agora in the dusk, its stalls empty and its colonnades falling into shadow, held this knowledge the way old stones hold the warmth of a day that has already ended, quietly, without announcement, in the particular stillness of things that have already become what they were going to become. Alcibiades arrived late, as he often did, and drunk, as he sometimes was, and garlanded with violets in the way of a man who wanted everyone at the table to register his entrance before he had said a single word. The dinner party at Agathon's house had been going for hours. The conversation had already reached its subject, love, its nature, its origin, whether it was a god or a demon, or a kind of hunger that the gods had placed in mortals to keep them reaching, and several men had already spoken at length, with varying degrees of eloquence, when the doors opened and Alcibiades fell through them, slightly unsteady, grinning, surrounded by flute girls and a small procession of admirers who managed to convey, by the tilt of their presence, that arriving with Alcibiades was its own form of celebration. He looked around the room, found the man he was looking for, and his face changed. Not into hostility, not into the smooth display of admiration that a man like Alcibiades would have deployed in a room full of people he was performing for, into something more complicated than either, into the expression of a person who loves someone from whom he has suffered and who is attempting in the moment of seeing them to hold both things at once. The man he was looking for was Socrates. Alcibiades would speak about him at length that evening, and Plato recorded those words in the symposium with a specificity that suggests he understood they contained something no abstract philosophical argument could carry. The texture of what it was actually like to be near this person, to want something from him, to be refused, not cruelly but philosophically, which is a different and more disorienting kind of refusal. He announced, when he had settled and been given wine, that he intended to tell the truth, not to praise Socrates in the way one praises a man at a dinner in his honor, but to tell the actual truth, which would require speaking about both love and suffering in the same breath. The room, full of men who prized their ability to speak well about difficult things, listened. What Alcibiades described, in the end, was a kind of statue. He compared Socrates to the carved figures of Silenus that appeared in craftsmen's shops throughout the agora, rough, ungainly wooden figures, ugly by every measure, Athenian culture recognized as measure, carved in the image of a drunken satyr with a pug nose and bulging eyes, and none of the formal grace that Athenian sculptors had spent generations perfecting. Silenus figures were hollow, open one, and inside, nestled in the carved wooden dark, you would find small divine figures, gold and carefully made, belonging to a world entirely different from the rough exterior that housed them. Alcibiades said that Socrates was exactly like this, that the outside, the broad flat nose, the protruding eyes, the thick neck, the plain cloak worn in every season, the bare feet on stone that would have made any Athenian of means wince, gave no indication whatsoever of what was inside. That once the inside was accessible to you, through conversation, through the particular quality of attention Socrates directed at the things that mattered, you could not unsee it, and that the experience of being close to that interior and then watching it turn its attention elsewhere was the specific form of suffering he had come to speak about. Athens in 399 BCE had very clear ideas about how the outside of a person corresponded to the inside. Beauty was not merely aesthetically valued, but morally significant, in the way that a culture can make almost anything morally significant if it chooses to embed the judgment deeply enough in its civic fabric. The aristocratic ideal, the kolokagathia, the beautiful and the good, held as a single concept, two words grown so close together they functioned as one, assumed that a man of noble bearing and fine physical form was likely to possess noble interior qualities, and that the connection was not merely coincidental, but somehow expressive of a coherent order in things. Statues of the gods were beautiful because the gods were excellent, and the inference ran in both directions. To be visibly ugly was in this framework, at minimum socially disadvantageous, and in certain company, a form of quiet social indictment. Socrates was visibly ugly by every available standard, and he knew it, and he was entirely unbothered by the knowledge. This was not bravado. It was something more considered. His indifference to his own appearance was continuous with a set of philosophical commitments that touched every aspect of how he lived, commitments that, taken together, amounted to a sustained argument in the form of a life. He owned almost nothing, not as an ascetic gesture, not as the performance of poverty that certain philosophers adopted as a kind of credential, but as the natural consequence of spending his time in philosophical conversation rather than in the acquisition of goods. He wore the same cloak in summer and winter, not because he was unaware of the cold, but because the cold was irrelevant to the things he considered worth attending to. He walked barefoot on the stone pavement of the agora, on the cold paving of a city that still remembered Periclean marble with the weight of recent pride, and the barefoot quality of his presence was noticed by everyone and explained nothing until you had spoken with him long enough to understand that the absence of sandals was not eccentricity, but consistency. He did not take money for his conversations. This is worth pausing over, because in Athens, as in most places where ideas are exchanged, the exchange of money was the conventional way of establishing that the exchange of ideas was serious. The sophists, the traveling teachers of rhetoric and argument, who had been part of Athenian intellectual life for decades, charged considerable fees, and the fees were understood to mark a transaction with defined obligations on both sides. The student paid for knowledge, and the teacher delivered it. What the student received was, in some measure, what the student had contracted for. Socrates refused this arrangement entirely, and his refusal was not modesty. He held, with the kind of quiet firmness that distinguishes a genuine philosophical position from a merely stated preference, that wisdom of the kind he was concerned with could not function as a commodity. The moment money changed hands, the teacher's conclusions became answers that the paying student's interests had shaped in advance. The inquiry had become at that moment something other than inquiry. The fee turned philosophy into a service, and a service is defined by the satisfaction of the customer, and the satisfaction of the customer is the one outcome genuinely disqualifying inquiry must be permitted to produce. So he asked questions instead. He asked them of generals and poets and craftsmen and politicians and young men with ambitions they had not yet examined and old men with reputations they had stopped questioning. He asked them in the agora and at dinner parties and in the shade of the colonnades and in the noisy space near the stalls where merchants were calling out prices and where no one expected to find a philosopher because philosophy was supposed to happen indoors with an audience of the willing, not outdoors in the ordinary traffic of a city going about its business. The questions were always apparently simple. What is courage? Socrates would ask a general who had demonstrated it on 3 campaigns and who had arrived at the agora expecting at most to buy something. Not whether courage was admirable, both men agreed it was, but what it actually was, what the thing was made of, whether it was the same thing in a soldier standing his ground as in a man who returns honest money to a man who would never know it was missing, whether a man could be courageous in an unjust cause, or whether the justice of the cause was somehow built into the definition, and if so, how. The general, who knew courage the way a craftsman knows his material, from the inside, through repetition and physical memory, would answer with confidence and precision, and Socrates would listen to the answer with complete, unhurried attention, and then ask the next question. And the next question would always find the same thing: a gap, a place where the confident, precise answer had assumed something it had not established, had used a word it had not defined, had drawn on a certainty that, when examined, turned out to be another question, wearing certainty's clothes. The general would fill the gap with another answer. Socrates would find the gap in that answer too. This process had a name: the elenchos, the cross-examination, the method of refutation that worked by taking a person's own stated beliefs and following them, with patience and apparent goodwill, to the place where they contradicted each other. The process was not comfortable. It was designed to be as honest as possible, which is not the same thing as comfortable, and the distinction mattered enormously in a city where the appearance of wisdom was a form of social capital that men of standing had been accumulating for decades. A man who emerged from a conversation with Socrates, having been unable to define the thing he had spent his career embodying or his life professing, was not, in most cases, grateful for the clarification. He was in the way of men whose sense of themselves has been publicly undermined, flushed with a particular mixture of embarrassment and anger, a mixture that had a specific quality because the embarrassment came first and was genuine, and the anger came second and was real, and because neither could be entirely directed at Socrates, since Socrates had not been unkind. He had simply asked questions. He had simply followed the answers wherever the answers led. The anger had nowhere entirely clean to go, and so it settled and accumulated, and Socrates acknowledged in his own account of himself that it had been accumulating for a long time. There was a name for this too. He called them the old accusations, the reputation that had gathered around him over decades, independent of any particular conversation, the impression that had formed in the civic atmosphere of Athens that he was a man who made trouble under the cover of questions, that he made clever arguments seem true, that he weakened traditional beliefs by treating them as claims to be examined rather than inheritances to be respected. Aristophanes had put a version of Socrates on the stage in the comedy called The Clouds, a quarter century before the trial. Dangling from a basket in the sky, his head in the clouds in the literal sense that the play made theatrical, studying celestial phenomena and teaching young men to argue any position well enough to defeat any opposing position, including the one their fathers held. The Socrates in the play was not the historical Socrates in any faithful sense, but the play had run before a large Athenian audience, and what remained in the civic memory after the performance was not accuracy, but impression, the shape of a man who floated above the ordinary moral world and looked down at it with ironic distance. The historical Socrates had spent his life doing approximately the opposite of floating. He had been, in the most literal sense, in the agora on the ground, among ordinary people, asking questions that presupposed that the ordinary moral world was exactly where the examination needed to happen. But the play had lodged its impression, and impressions, in a democracy with a citizen jury, carry weight that arguments sometimes cannot displace. He was born around 470 BCE. His father, by what survives, was a stonemason, his mother a midwife, and he used the midwife's work as a metaphor for his own. He did not deliver ideas himself, he said, but helped others bring into the open the ideas they were already carrying, ideas that might be healthy and viable, or might turn out, in the light of examination, to be stillborn. He had served as a soldier on at least 3 campaigns, with a steadiness under conditions of difficulty that Alcibiades himself, who had fought alongside him, remembered with something close to awe. He was, in the war, the same as he was in the agora, unhurried, consistently himself. The cold and the danger did not produce in him the expressions of distress that the cold and the danger produced in other men, not because he was performing composure, but because his composure seemed to originate in a settled interior that external conditions could not easily reach. He was married to Xanthippe, about whom the ancient tradition preserves stories of considerable difficulty. She appears in various sources as sharp-tongued, demanding, temperamentally contrary to her husband's philosophical equanimity, in ways that later writers found useful for comic and moral purposes. The real quality of that marriage is not recoverable, and the tradition's desire to cast Xanthopy as a counterweight to Socratic calm probably tells more about what later audiences found satisfying than about the actual household. They had children. He had a life of ordinary domestic complexity alongside the life of philosophical conversation that has entirely displaced it in the historical record. And he had, from some point in his adult life, a thing he called his daimonion, not a god in the public sense, not a figure within the religious apparatus that Athens maintained through its festival calendar and its sacrifices and its civic observances, through which the community believed it maintained the divine protection that made the city's endeavors possible. The daimonion was entirely private, entirely personal, and it did not give instructions in the way a god, through an oracle, might give instructions. It did not point toward action, it intervened against it. It was, as Socrates described it, a voice or sign that arrived to restrain him when he was about to do something that would turn out badly, an internal break, felt with sufficient regularity and sufficient reliability that he had come to trust it, the way one might trust a sense one cannot fully explain. He was consistent in his accounts of what it was not. It was not divine inspiration in the public sense. It was not a claim to a private channel to the gods that superseded the city's relationship with the divine. It was the quieter thing, an interior signal oriented toward restraint, specific to him. The distinction was philosophically significant and legally significant, and the two kinds of significance pulled in the same direction. Athens' civic religion was not a matter of personal faith in the interior sense that certain later traditions would make central. It was a matter of public obligation. The gods were embedded in the political calendar. The major festivals were civic events, attended not in the way of private devotion, but in the way of communal obligation, the maintenance of the city's standing with the divine that protected it. Impiety was not a personal theological failing, it was a civic negligence. If a citizen failed to honor the gods in the ways the city's tradition required, the damage was not to the citizen's private soul, but to the collective relationship with the divine, on which the entire city depended. In this framework, a man who spoke of a private religious sign, a personal daimonion that operated outside and alongside the city's official religious structures, was doing something that could be heard as an implicit commentary on the adequacy of those structures. Whether Socrates intended that commentary or not, whether the daimonion was a claim against civic religion or simply alongside it, was the kind of question the city could ask itself in settled times with something like curiosity, and in unsettled times with something like alarm. Athens in 399 BCE was not settled. Socrates had come of age in the Athens of Pericles, the confident imperial Athens that had built the Parthenon and filled the treasury with tribute and organized its culture around the idea of itself as the educational center of the Greek world. By the time of the trial that Athens had been dissolving for a generation, the war had ended in defeat. The democratic government had been overthrown and replaced by the oligarchic regime called the 30, which had governed for 8 months with a brutality that Athens had not inflicted on itself before, and which had been replaced by the restored democracy under a formal amnesty that made it illegal to prosecute men for what they had done under the 30. The amnesty was legally sound and politically necessary, and it meant that a city carrying significant unhealed wounds had agreed by law to refrain from using the legal system to address them. The grief and the anger were present. The legal channels were closed. Socrates had been associated, in public perception, with men whose roles in the catastrophic years were impossible to misread. Alcibiades, whom he had loved in some serious sense of a word that the symposium circles without fully defining, had been the brilliant, destructive general whose political and military failures had contributed substantially to Athens' defeat. Critias, who had known Socrates in his youth, had become the most ruthless member of the 30, the man most directly responsible for the reign of terror that Athens now carried in its recent memory. Neither association had been chosen carelessly by Socrates, and neither had resulted from a philosophical failure on his part. His refusal to participate in the 30's unlawful orders was documented, a specific act of non-compliance at personal risk. His relationship with Alcibiades was not a political endorsement, but the associations existed in the civic record, and in a city that had closed the legal channels against grievance, associations became a kind of unofficial accounting, a way of assigning responsibility through proximity when the amnesty had made direct assignment impossible. None of this made Socrates responsible for the careers of men he had known. The logic of association was not the logic of philosophy, and Socrates knew the difference better than almost anyone. But the city was not always in a philosophical mood when it was afraid, and the restored democracy's instinct to protect traditional values, the gods, the proper education of youth, the civic customs that held the community together when everything else was under pressure, made Socrates' particular habits and associations a civic concern in a way they might not have been in more stable years. He asked uncomfortable questions. He kept unusual company. He had a private religious sign. He made young men doubt things their fathers had told them, which in a city that had just seen its young men follow a brilliant man's vision into catastrophe might not feel like a small thing. He walked through all of it barefoot, with the same unhurried quality of attention. At a symposium some years before the trial, the exact year is uncertain, and the symposium itself is Plato's philosophical reconstruction rather than a transcript, but the human texture it captures has the quality of memory as much as invention. Alcibiades had tried to seduce him. This is not a detail preserved for its strangeness alone. Alcibiades was, by general agreement, the most beautiful man in Athens, in the way that Athens found beautiful young, physically perfect by the aristocratic standard, magnetic in the particular way of people who have always been watched and have organized themselves around being watched, and found that the organization suits them. To decline Alcibiades in the social world of the Athenian aristocracy was not a small gesture. It was a statement about what order of thing had been refused, and for the sake of what. Alcibiades described, in the symposium's account of that evening, lying beside Socrates through the night, and being met with warm and complete attention, not with the thing he had offered, but with philosophical conversation. When the night ended and nothing had happened, he was not dismissed. He was, in some sense he found difficult to name, more seen than he had expected, and at the same time refused in a way that had nothing contemptuous in it. The refusal came from the same place as the attention, from a settled interior that had different priorities than the ones Alcibiades had arranged himself around. He said that to hear Socrates speak was like nothing else, that the speeches of the sophists heard afterward seemed like performances by comparison, the speeches of men who knew they were shaping an audience. Socrates spoke as though the argument was the thing, and the argument happened to involve people, and the people were important precisely because the argument needed them to be honest rather than decorative. His words, Alcibiades said, were the only ones that had ever made him feel that his own life was not being lived correctly, and he found that he could be away from Socrates for long periods and feel nothing but that in his presence the feeling returned with its full force, and that he had not entirely decided whether that was a gift or an affliction. The yin made itself visible in the agora sometimes as a quality of arrested attention. Socrates would be mid-sentence, mid-question, and then he would go still in the particular way of a man who has just heard something the people around him cannot hear. The person he was speaking with would wait, with the slightly uncertain quality of a person who is not sure whether to continue or to remain silent, and Socrates would remain in that interior space for some span of time, not long, but noticeable, the way the pause in a conversation is always longer than it feels, and then return, without explanation or apology, to the thread he had been following. He did not explain the daimonoion away. He did not offer alternative accounts of it. He said what he knew, which was that the sign came, that it restrained, and that it had not, in his experience, led him wrong. What it was, at its root, he held with the same honest ignorance he held everything he could not verify, acknowledged, named, not overclaimed. He would stand this way in the middle of conversations that were going badly, in conversations that were going well, in moments when the person he was speaking with had just said something that opened a new line of thought, and Socrates was following it inward before bringing it back out into speech. The stillness was not rudeness. It was not the stillness of a man whose attention had drifted. It was the stillness of a man who was somewhere very specifically, just somewhere no one else could follow him. The craftsman whose stall Socrates passed on his way through the agora on any given morning, the potter or the sandal maker, or the man who sold the painted wooden tablets that citizens used as writing surfaces, could have observed him on dozens of mornings without finding anything unusual. A man in a plain cloak, barefoot, stopping to ask about the work, genuinely curious about the work, in the particular way of a person who finds everything legitimately interesting because everything followed carefully enough, arrives at the same questions. What do you know when you know how to make a sandal? Is the knowing in the hands? Can it be taught to someone who has never touched leather? What would it mean to teach someone to be good in the way that one teaches someone to be a sandal maker? And does the parallel hold? And if it does not hold, where precisely does it break? The craftsman, if he was experienced enough, might have recognized the question as the beginning of something, might have chosen to engage or to deflect, might have found, an hour later, that the fish he had come to the agora to buy had not been bought because he was still in the conversation, and that the conversation had left him unable to state with confidence something he had been confident about that morning. Whether he found this productive or irritating depended on the man. Whether he came back to the question later, in the quiet of an evening, or whether he set it down and resumed being confident, that depended too on something in his particular constitution that Socrates himself might have been curious about, and certainly had no control over. Socrates was in his late 60s when the trial came. He had been asking questions in this city for decades. He had accumulated resentments in the way that a careful, unhurried man accumulates them, not through hostility or ambition or the ordinary frictions of competitive social life, but through the specific friction of being, repeatedly, the person in whose presence other people's certainties became uncertain. The resentments were real. He acknowledged them. He named them in his own account of himself. The old accusations, the cloud of reputation that had gathered before any formal charge was ever filed. They were not the product of malice exactly. They were the product of a city that had been through a great deal, and that had organized its survival around certain things, the gods, the young men, the traditions, and that had, in the vicinity of a man who treated all such things as questions rather than foundations, felt a kind of exposure it could not always name precisely. At the end of a long day of conversation, when the agora was emptying and the afternoon light was beginning to change the color of the stone and the colonnades were falling into their early shadow, Socrates would sometimes sit at the edge of the market in a stillness that was not fatigue. He had just spent hours following arguments wherever they led, asking one question, and then the question inside that question, and then the question inside that one, and finding at each level the same honest territory, the place where knowledge turned out to be assumption, where certainty turned out to be habit, where the careful following of a thought brought you not to an answer, but to a clearer view of how far the question actually went. He sat in this result without distress. The people whose certainties he had examined were gone, some of them carrying a productive unease, and some of them carrying only resentment. He had not been able to control which, and he knew it, and the knowledge did not appear to weigh heavily. There is a specific kind of freedom in a life organized entirely around asking rather than answering. It is not the freedom of having resolved things. It is the freedom of having set down the need to resolve them, of having found through enough patient inquiry that the question itself was the condition worth inhabiting, and that dwelling there without the pressure of the answer was not a deprivation, but a different kind of fullness. Socrates sat at the day's end on the emptying stone with his elbows on his knees and his bare feet on the pavement, and his eyes open on nothing in particular, and he was, by his own account, a man who knew almost nothing, and who had found, in the long years of finding this out, that the knowing of it was the most honest ground available. The day's resentments were somewhere behind him. The questions were still present, and they were his, and they were not going anywhere, and neither was he for the moment. And the evening came on in the unhurried way that evenings do, and the stone held the day's warmth a little longer than the air. A spring morning in Athens, in the year 399 BCE. The sun has been up for perhaps 2 hours, and already it carries the particular warmth of a season that has not yet learned restraint. The law court is open to the sky, not a building so much as a defined open space, marked by stone and boundary, the kind of place that functions by the understood agreement of everyone present to treat it as what it has been declared to be. Citizens are taking their places. There are approximately 500 of them, perhaps a few more, drawn by lot from the rolls of eligible Athenian men, ordinary in the way that any large group of people gathered for a consequential purpose is ordinary, some attentive, some already settling into the habitual inattention of men who have sat on many juries, and found the process more tedious than the occasion warranted. Miletus is standing. He is described in the historical record as a young man, thin-faced, with long hair that marked him as the kind of person who thought of himself as a poet. He holds the formal document of indictment, and he reads it aloud in the precise legally required language that Athenian procedure demanded. The words are specific and exact. Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, of the Demi-Elopate, is accused of failing to acknowledge the gods the city acknowledges, and of introducing other new divine beings, and of corrupting the young men of Athens. The penalty demanded is death. Miletus reads this plainly. The morning holds it. 500 men listen. The charge of failing to acknowledge the city's gods was not simply a matter of private belief. Athenian civic religion was woven into the calendar, into the festivals, into the rhythms of public life, in a way that made impiety a concern of the whole community, not a matter between an individual and his conscience. The gods protected Athens. They required acknowledgement. A man who introduced new divine beings, or who failed in the required observances, was not merely eccentric in his private theological life, he was potentially compromising the arrangement on which the city's safety depended. This was how the charge was felt, at least by those who felt it seriously. The second charge, corrupting the young, carried its own particular weight in 399 BCE. The Greek word used, diaphterion, was not a gentle word. It did not suggest merely influencing or leading astray in the mild sense of encouraging unconventional opinions. It implied something closer to active ruination, to the spoiling of something that had been sound. And the city had a specific recent and still tender history of young men associated with Socrates, who had brought catastrophe to Athens in one form or another. The jury of 500 citizens did not need to have read the charge carefully to feel its resonance. The name alone carried it. Socrates rises to speak. He is 70 years old. He has lived his entire life in Athens, has left it only to serve in military campaigns, and has spent the decades of his mature life doing, publicly, exactly what he will be described as having done. He is not surprised by the charges. He says so, in a way. His opening words in the apology are not an appeal to sympathy, not the expected reaching toward the jury's mercy, not the conventional lamentation over a good man unjustly pursued. He begins instead by observing that his accusers have spoken very skillfully and persuasively, so skillfully that even he was almost taken in by them, and then adds, immediately, that they have said almost nothing that is true. The quality of attention in the courtroom shifts. This is not how defendants begin. He continues. He tells the jury that he is not a skilled speaker in the way his accusers are skilled, that he asks only to be judged by one criterion, whether what he says is true. His voice, he says, will be the same voice he uses in the agora, among ordinary people, in the kind of conversation he has been having his whole life. He will not change his manner for the court. He will not adjust the register. He will not, as the conventional phrase had it, dress his words for the occasion. He asks only that the jury not be disturbed by this, and that they judge the manner of speech less than its content. The request is delivered so plainly that it takes several moments to register as a demand. There were 3 accusers. Meletus the poet served as the nominal lead, the one whose name stood at the top of the indictment and who would speak first for the prosecution. Lycon, about whom the historical record is relatively sparse, spoke as well, but the third accuser, the one whose presence gave the prosecution its real weight, was Entus. Entus was not a marginal figure. He was a tanner, which in Athens meant a man of substantial means and practical influence, and he had been central to the democratic restoration of 403 BCE, the return of democratic governance after the brutal period of oligarchic rule by the faction known as the 30. He was, in a real sense, the civic establishment that had survived the worst of Athens' recent history and emerged with democratic legitimacy intact. His presence in the prosecution meant that this was not the act of a few aggrieved individuals. It had the sanction of the restored order. Socrates understood this. He addresses it, in his way throughout the apology, not by confronting Anytus directly, but by something more structurally telling. He calls Meletus to the stand and cross-examines him. He chooses the nominal accuser, the young poet, the lesser figure, and leads him carefully through the corruption charge. Who, Socrates asks, improves the young men of Athens? Meletus answers, the laws. The jurors, says Socrates, they improve the young? Yes. And the citizens generally? Yes, all of them. So Socrates continues, working through the logic with the unhurried patience of a man who has spent 50 years following arguments wherever they lead. If all citizens of Athens improve the young, then only Socrates corrupts them? Only one man out of the entire city destroys what everyone else maintains? Meletus, led this way, does not find a comfortable place to stand. He shifts, he asserts, he becomes, under the patient cross-examination, visibly less certain of a charge he had delivered with confidence half an hour before. Socrates draws him further. He asks whether a man could possibly want to corrupt his own neighbors, given that corrupted neighbors cause harm to the man who corrupts them. Molest says Socrates corrupts intentionally. Then Socrates observes, pointing to an established principle of Athenian jurisprudence, as well as simple reasoning, if he does harm intentionally, the proper response is instruction and correction, not a criminal trial. Since a man who harms intentionally has a problem that correction can address, while one who harms by ignorance has a problem that punishment cannot. This distinction between intentional and unintentional wrongdoing was not obscure legal philosophy. It was widely understood, and the jury heard it. 500 men watched a young poet lose control of the argument he had brought to court. The silence was not entirely comfortable. The religious charge was harder to navigate with simple logic, and Socrates did not try to dissolve it the same way. Instead, he pointed to what seemed to him its internal contradiction. Meletus had accused him of introducing new divine beings, which implied that he believed in divine beings of some kind, new or old, and the charge of not acknowledging the city's gods therefore required that he believe in no gods at all, which contradicted the first charge. He could not be guilty of both. He could not simultaneously believe in new divine beings and believe in no divine beings. The logic of the indictment, held up to examination, did not hold together. Meletus was by most readings of the Apology thoroughly outmaneuvered by this point, and yet this fact alone settled nothing. Socrates himself acknowledged, in the course of his defense, that the charges he faced that day were not the real charges, or not the only ones. He spoke of older accusations accumulated over decades, the slow residue of resentment left behind by years of encountering powerful and respected Athenians, and through patient conversation, revealing that what they believed to be knowledge was something else. The general who could not define courage, the statesman who could not explain justice, the poet who could not account for his own poetry. Each of them had walked away from conversations with Socrates having gained something difficult and lost something comfortable, and not everyone made the trade willingly or forgave the man who offered it. He described this history with a quality of rueful clarity, as though he had known for a long time that the reputation accumulating around him in the city was a separate problem from any specific charge, one that a single afternoon of cross-examination in an open court could not undo. The jury of 500 citizens brought their own accumulated impressions to the courtroom that morning. The comedy of Aristophanes, which had placed a character called Socrates in a basket in the clouds, speculating absurdly about natural phenomena and teaching young men to evade their obligations. The association of his name with Alcibiades, who had betrayed Athens to Sparta and then to Persia, the association with Critias, who had been among the most ruthless of the 30 tyrants. None of these associations appeared in the formal indictment. All of them were present in the room. The philosopher who had spent 50 years asking questions found himself in a position where the questions preceded him had in some sense tried him already in the informal court of civic reputation before the formal charge was ever filed. He turned to this directly. The defense he offered in the Apology was not only a legal defense, it was something broader and more unusual, a philosophical mission statement, delivered under oath before 500 citizens who held his life in their judgment. He told the jury the story of the oracle at Delphi and how the oracle had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and how he had set out to disprove this by finding someone wiser, and how the search had led him through the politicians and the craftsmen and the poets of Athens, and how, at the end of each conversation, he had come to the same conclusion that the men who believed themselves to be in possession of knowledge were not, and that his one small advantage over them was knowing that he did not know. He described this as a service to Athens, a service imposed on him, he said, by the god, by the oracle's declaration, by the divine assignment he had received, whether he wanted it or not. He was, he told the jury, a kind of gift to the city, a gadfly attached to a large and somewhat sluggish horse, stinging it into wakefulness. Remove the gadfly, and the horse returns to sleep. The image is not a flattering one for Athens, and the jury heard that too. Whether this analogy helped him is a question the historical record answers in its own way. He went further. When speaking of his personal divine sign, the inward voice, the restraining signal he called his daimonion, he described something that was genuinely difficult for an Athenian jury to place. It was not the public religion of Athens, not the gods on the Acropolis, not the festivals and the sacrifices. It was private, internal, non-transferable. It never told him what to do. It only ever stopped him from doing things. It was, by any reasonable definition, an unusual theological position, and Socrates described it in straightforward terms that made no effort to render it more conventional than it was. He was not performing impiety. He seems, by every available account, to have genuinely believed in it. But genuine belief in something structurally different from the city's gods, described openly in a courtroom before 500 citizens already uncertain of the charges they were hearing, is not a position that resolves the religious question in the defendant's favor. The morning wore on. The sun had moved. The warmth was fuller now, the kind that makes stone surfaces radiant and the open air of a courtyard pressed gently against the skin. The jury, having heard the prosecution and the defense, voted. The count was approximately 281 to 220 in favor of conviction. The margin was not wide. More than 200 citizens had voted to acquit. The city was genuinely divided, genuinely uncertain, and the vote reflected that. But the trial was not over. Athenian procedure allowed the convicted defendant to propose a counter penalty, which the jury would then vote on as an alternative to the penalty the prosecution had demanded. This was a formal mechanism built into the legal structure that allowed a convicted man to propose something the jury might find more proportionate than death. The mechanism assumed, by its very existence, that the defendant would use it in the expected way, proposing exile, or a fine, or some other penalty that acknowledged the gravity of the conviction, while offering the jury a path to mercy. Socrates rose to make his counter-proposal. He acknowledged that the proper form required him to estimate a penalty, and that he had been trying to think of what the appropriate penalty for a man who had spent his life in service to the city, benefiting it, would be. He had arrived at an answer. His counter-proposal was this: free meals at the Prytaneum for the rest of his life. The Prytaneum was the civic center of Athens, the place where the city's sacred hearth was maintained, and where citizens who had performed extraordinary service to Athens, victorious athletes at the Panhellenic Games, generals who had won great battles, were honored with meals at public expense. It was among the most distinguished honors the city could confer. Socrates proposed it for himself in the measured philosophical voice he had used throughout the day, and explained that he had estimated the penalty sincerely. A man who had genuinely served Athens his whole life deserved not punishment, but honor, 500 citizens heard this. The quality of attention in the courtroom had been shifting all morning, but now it moved into a different territory altogether, something between astonishment and a particular kind of anger that comes not from contempt, but from the feeling of being, once again, exactly in the position this man always put the people around him in. He was not being reckless. He was not performing defiance. He appears, reading the apology carefully, to have meant it. He did, eventually, acknowledge that perhaps a fine was more realistic, and suggested a small amount, amended upward, apparently at the urging of his friends to 30 minae. The alternative of exile was raised and declined. Socrates told the jury he did not believe exile would be an improvement. Wherever he went, he would continue to do what he did in Athens, and the young men of those cities would listen to him the same way the young men of Athens did. And whatever city he chose for his exile would face the same problem, after a few months, that Athens had decided it could not tolerate any longer. He was not offering the jury a version of himself that could be sent quietly somewhere else and relied upon to stay quiet. He was offering them the full account of what he was. The jury voted a second time, where the first vote had shown real division, a close thing, a city genuinely uncertain. The second vote moved more decisively toward death. The margin was larger than the first. It is not possible, at this distance, to know exactly what happened in the minds of those additional votes. But the arithmetic suggests it clearly enough. Some proportion of the jury that had been inclined to leniency, that had been willing to consider exile or a serious fine, had encountered the counter-proposal and found in it something they could not move past. The composure, the consistency, the refusal to present a modified version of himself that the city's institutions could manage. These qualities, in the first vote, had perhaps left open the possibility of mercy. In the space between the two votes, they had become something else. And yet Socrates, in the recorded words of the apology, addressed the verdict with the same quality of attention he had maintained throughout. He spoke to those who had voted to convict, and he told them that they had not gained what they believed they had gained, that silencing him would not produce the silence they were reaching for, that there would be others, younger, sharper, less measured in their questions, who would do what he had done, and that the trouble was not Socrates, but the examination itself, which could not be stopped by stopping the man who practiced it. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it as a consequence, as a man who has followed an argument to its logical end and found that the end is not where anyone in the room wanted to arrive. He spoke to those who had voted to acquit, separately, with a different quality of attention. He told them that his divine sign had not stopped him that morning. It had been silent. He took this to mean that what was happening was not, in the largest sense, an evil, that the death ahead, whatever it turned out to be, was not something the voice that had restrained him throughout his life had judged it necessary to prevent. Whether death was a dreamless sleep, or a continuation of existence in some other form, or an opportunity to continue, in whatever region lay beyond the present one, the conversations that had constituted his life here. He had thought about each possibility and found none of them obviously worse than the life he would be living in exile or in the enforced silence of an acquittal with conditions. This last thought is worth holding. He genuinely seems to have considered these possibilities, not as consolations, not as the kind of reassuring argument a man makes to the people watching him in order to spare them distress, but as real philosophical positions, each with its own weight and logic. The dreamless sleep, nothing to fear, since there is no one to experience the nothing. The continuation, a chance to speak with Orpheus, with Hesiod, with the great men of the past, without any of them having the authority to execute him for it. He described this second possibility with something that reads, even across 24 centuries, as genuine interest. The court was beginning to dissolve into smaller conversations, the way large official gatherings do when the official part ends and the accumulated feeling of the room breaks into many smaller rooms. Men were finding their friends. The prosecution was moving through its own aftermath. The friends of Socrates, among them, somewhere in the crowd, the young Plato, who was present and would later say he was too ill to be there at the execution, though some scholars read this differently, were in the particular state of a grief that has not yet settled into its final form, still carrying the quality of shock that comes when a thing long feared has finally become actual. In the middle of all this, Socrates remained, not arrested to the spot, not held by ceremony, simply, apparently himself. The same quality of attention he had brought to every conversation in the agora over 50 years, the unhurried willingness to follow a question wherever it went, the refusal to perform emotions the argument had not produced in him, the steady orientation toward whatever was true rather than whatever was convenient, was present in him now, in the open-air court where the vote had just been counted, the same way it had been present in him that morning when Meletus read the indictment, and the same way it had been present in him, by all accounts, every morning of his adult life. The formal occasion of the trial had served, ultimately, as a kind of clarifying frame around something that had always been visible. 500 citizens had spent a morning watching a man whose whole life had been organized around a single commitment that the examined question was worth more than the comfortable answer, that the city's health depended on the willingness of its members to sit with difficulty long enough to understand it, and they had voted, in that majority, that the city was not prepared to receive what he had given it. The margin of the first vote showed that many of them were genuinely uncertain, genuinely divided, genuinely unable to place him in any category they were used to using. The second vote's larger margin showed something about the limits of what a legal proceeding can do with a man who uses the legal proceeding as a continuation of his philosophical practice. Outside the court, the city continued. The harbor was audible if you listened for it. The ordinary commerce of the morning going forward in the agora, the smell of the Attic spring in the air above the stone buildings, the Parthenon still visible from almost anywhere in Athens, standing in its physical confidence above a city that was trying, with imperfect instruments, to work out what to do with itself. In the weeks that followed, Socrates would be held in the state prison. The sacred ship to Delos had set out at the beginning of the trial period, and executions could not be carried out until it returned, a month, perhaps more, of waiting in which the philosophical conversations continued in the prison among his friends, as though the verdict had simply provided a new location for the inquiry rather than ending it. The indictment had asked 500 men to decide whether one man's questions posed a danger sufficient to require his death. The vote had answered the question in the terms the procedure offered. What the trial had not resolved, what it had, in a certain light, made more visible, was the question behind the question, whether a community that values reason can permanently sustain the particular kind of reasoner who turns that value back on itself, who uses the community's own commitment to examination to examine the community. The men who voted to convict were not, by most accounts, simple men or cruel ones. Anytus was a serious political figure who had survived genuine political terror and helped restore the democratic institutions the city had been built on. Meletus had a complaint that however poorly he defended it in cross-examination, came from a real place in the city's anxiety. The jury included men who had, by the margin of the first vote, wanted to find a way to acquit. The verdict was not a simple verdict. It was the outcome of genuine uncertainty, accumulated grievance, recent political trauma, and the structural difficulty of holding, within the same civic space, both the freedom that democracy promised and the specific kind of freedom that Socrates practiced, which is not the freedom of the assembly, or the freedom of commerce, or the freedom of movement, but the freedom of the question that does not stop when the questioner becomes inconvenient. What the trial had made legible, in the long accounting of it, is something that every community organized around shared values eventually encounters, that the values themselves can be questioned, that the questioner will be among the community's own members, and that the community must decide each time whether the questioning is a form of service or a form of attack. Athens decided, by a margin, that it was the latter. The decision was arrived at through the formal mechanisms of democratic procedure, through open argument, through the free vote of citizens. Whether this fact makes the decision more or less troubling is a question the trial raised and did not answer. It was not the kind of question a trial could answer. The morning had begun with Miletus reading the indictment in the formulaic language of legal procedure. It ended with the formal announcement of a sentence of death, delivered in the same procedural language, with the same official form, as though the distance between the first words and the last were a matter of paperwork rather than philosophy. And Socrates, leaving the courtroom in the direction of the prison, walked with the same quality he had always had, not hurried, not in the performed calm of a man forcing equanimity against the current of his own fear, but simply present, following the thread of whatever came next, with the same attention he had given to every other thread his life had placed before him. A verdict brings a trial to its end. It closes the formal proceeding, releases the jury back into their ordinary days, returns the law court to the ordinary air it had been set apart from for a morning. What a verdict cannot close is the question the trial assembled itself around, which continues in the minds of those who heard it, which sets itself into the record of events that will be read and argued over as long as there are people with the patience to read carefully. The trial of Socrates has been read carefully for 2,400 years. The verdict has been known for all of them. The question has not, in all that time, been quieted. The oracle had said something Socrates could not leave alone. He had heard the report of it, the way one hears news that seems at first to be about someone else, a name attached to a claim that does not quite fit the person who holds that name. The oracle at Delphi, through whoever had gone to ask, had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. And Socrates, standing somewhere in the agora on an ordinary afternoon, had turned this over in his mind and found it genuinely puzzling, not flattering, not unsettling in the way of a warning, simply wrong, in a way that required investigation, because he knew with the same directness he brought to everything that he possessed no wisdom worth the name. He knew almost nothing. He was certain of almost nothing. And an oracle that called this the highest wisdom available in Athens was either mistaken or meant something he did not yet understand. He decided to go and find someone wiser, not to be difficult, not to expose the oracle, out of genuine curiosity, the same curiosity that made him stop fishmongers and generals with equal unhurried attention. He went to find the person who would prove the oracle wrong. He would find a genuinely wise man, bring that finding back, and the oracle would have its error demonstrated. The first man he visited had a reputation that reached across the city. He was a statesman, admired, well-spoken, accustomed to deference. He held views about many things, about justice, about what the city required, about how men ought to conduct themselves in public life. Socrates sat with him and began to ask, not accusingly, not cleverly, in the way of someone who already knows the corner he will walk you into. He asked the way he always asked, carefully, following the thread wherever it actually went, staying close to what the man actually said rather than what he meant to say. And gradually, with the particular quality of stillness that Socrates brought to every examination, something became visible. The statesman believed he knew what justice was. He could not say what justice was. These two facts turned out to be in the same man at the same time, and Socrates, having found them together there, was left with a quiet conclusion. This man believed he had wisdom he did not have. Socrates, at least, did not believe that. His ignorance, whatever else it was something he actually possessed, something genuinely his. In that one small way, he was closer to the truth than the man who had just explained it to him. He went to others. He went to the poets, whose verses held what seemed like deep understanding, lines about fate and the gods and the nature of suffering that arrived with the authority of genuine knowledge. He sat with a celebrated poet and asked what the poem meant, what this image was pointing at, what this particular claim about the gods was based on, and the poet could not say. He could say that the poem had come to him, that it had arrived with the quality of inspiration, that something had moved through him when he wrote it. He could not explain it. He could not say what knowledge it expressed, because it had not come from knowledge, it had come from elsewhere. And Socrates, who had genuinely expected to find wisdom in those lines, left with a more careful understanding of what poetry was and what it was not. It was not knowledge dressed in beautiful clothing. It was something else, something real perhaps, something that moved through certain people and emerged as music. But it was not the same as knowing what one was saying, and the poets who confused the two had added a layer of confusion to the confusion already present in the world. He went to the craftsman, and here he found something different. Here were people who genuinely knew things. They knew their materials, the behavior of clay under specific pressures, the way certain metals took an edge, the patience that particular work required. This was knowledge. It was specific and verifiable and could be demonstrated. He had not expected to find it in an artisan's stall, and he felt something close to relief. But then the craftsmen, because they knew these concrete things, believed that their knowledge extended further, that the understanding of a craft implied an understanding of larger questions, of virtue, of what was good for the city. And this was where the knowledge stopped, even as the confidence continued. The craftsman who knew how to make a fine bowl did not thereby know what a fine life was, and the confusion of these two things added its own difficulty to the picture. Genuine skill, carried past its actual boundary, became a new kind of false certainty. He did this for years. What he accumulated over those years in the agora was not wisdom, it was something more uncomfortable, and in the end, more useful. He accumulated a clear map of the territory where knowledge was absent and confidence was not. He found this territory everywhere, in the assembly, in the law courts, in the dinner parties, where men of standing explained with great authority what justice required, what piety consisted of, what courage ultimately was. They could not say. They could approach the question, begin to answer it, offer examples, but when the examples were examined, when the definition was pushed to its edges and asked to hold, it gave way, every time, not because the men were foolish, but because the questions were genuinely difficult, and the men had not noticed this. They had lived with the words justice, piety, courage for so long that the words had come to feel like answers. The words were not answers. The words were the beginning of questions that had not yet been asked with sufficient care. Socrates, having asked them with care, arrived back at the oracle's declaration and found it somewhat less puzzling than before, not because he had found wisdom, but because the oracle's claim was not that he had it was that no one had it more than he did. And this, looked at, honestly, might simply mean that the only advantage he held was the advantage of knowing what he did not know. A small advantage, a strange advantage, but a real one in a city full of people who did not know what they did not know and had no particular interest in finding out. There is something that happens at the bottom of genuine inquiry, something Socrates seemed to find and return to so many times that it had become the ground under everything. When the confident answers fall away, when the well-worn definition fails, when the argument reaches the edge of its actual territory and admits it, what remains is not nothing. What remains is the question itself, stripped of the comfortable certainty that had been draped over it, standing in its actual form. And the question in its actual form is not frightening. It is, in a particular way that is difficult to describe and easy to recognize when it is felt, something closer to open, not resolved, not comfortable, but genuinely open in the way that something with space in it is open, not the emptiness of a loss, but the openness of a room after the furniture has been moved, where the proportions of things can finally be seen. This is what Socrates described in the Apology as the beginning of wisdom, and his description of it was not modest. He meant it plainly and with genuine force, that the recognition of one's own ignorance is not a weakness to be corrected, but the only honest ground from which honest inquiry can begin. The person who believes they already know what justice is has, in a specific and serious sense, closed the question. The question has become a conclusion, and a conclusion dressed as a question is the most efficient possible stopper of thought. Socrates, who knew he did not know, had kept the question genuinely open, and keeping it genuinely open meant the inquiry could continue. It meant the conversation could go somewhere real, rather than somewhere settled. It meant that the encounter in the agora between two people, one of whom was Socrates, was not a performance of exchanged positions, but a genuine movement, however uncomfortable, towards something neither of them yet had. What it cost was a quality of friction that accumulated slowly. A general who has been admired in the assembly and then cannot define courage in conversation with a small barefoot man is not grateful for the experience. He walks away with something that does not resolve quickly, a particular kind of self-awareness that he had not requested and did not know what to do with. He had been comfortable with his certainty. The certainty had served him. The examination of the certainty had not ruined him, had not refuted his military record, had not touched any of the things he had actually built in the world, but it had left him with a question where before there had been a settled answer, and questions in places where there were once answers have a way of remaining there, returning in moments of quiet, reopening in the middle of the night, when other thoughts are still. Over decades, these moments of reopening accumulated across the city. Socrates himself, in the Apology, acknowledged this with the directness that was characteristic of everything he said. He knew about the old accusations. He knew that the resentments ran long and wide, that they had been building for years before any formal charges were composed, that the men who had felt the particular discomfort of being cross-examined in the agora had not forgotten it and had found ways to pass that feeling along to others who had not been present. The reputation had moved through the city, ahead of the man. The Aristophanes play had given the resentment a comic form, and spread it to thousands of citizens who had never spoken with Socrates personally, but who had sat in the theater and laughed at the caricature of the philosopher in his basket, tangled in impractical questions about the clouds. A caricature lodged in memory is difficult to dislodge with argument. Socrates knew that he was arguing against an impression that had had decades to settle. He described himself in the Apology as a gadfly. The image was not chosen carelessly. He was specific about it. Athens was like a large, well-bred horse, strong, capable, but by virtue of its size and success, inclined toward a certain sluggishness, a comfortable torpor in which the difficult questions were not asked because they did not need to be asked, because everything was functioning well enough, because the city had gods, and festivals, and laws, and a democratic assembly, and the memory of Thermopylae and the Parthenon visible on its hill, and what, in all this functioning, required the intervention of a small barefoot man, asking whether anyone actually knew what justice was. The gadfly stings the horse awake, not to injure, not even to make it move in any particular direction, to sting it into the quality of attention that its size and comfort had allowed it to neglect, to sting it into wakefulness, which is not a pleasant experience for the horse, and which the horse, once awake, does not universally appreciate. What Socrates argued in that image was not a small claim. He was saying that his disruption of civic complacency was not an attack on the city, but a form of service. The city was constitutionally unable to recognize as such. The city wanted to sleep. He was the thing that kept it from sleeping, and the city's desire to remove that thing, to recover the comfortable certainty he had disturbed, was not a sign of the city's strength, but of exactly the sluggishness the disturbance was intended to address. The jury that condemned him was demonstrating, in the very act of condemnation, the civic torpor that his presence had been set against. He said this without cruelty, but he said it. There is an image that arrived later, composed by his student, writing in the years after the death, that holds this same understanding in a different form. It begins underground, in a place without windows, in a long cavern. A group of people sit chained in a fixed position. They have been there always. They face a wall on which shadows move, shapes cast by objects passing before a fire behind them, objects they cannot see, the fire they cannot turn toward. They have been watching shadows their whole lives. They have developed sophistication in the watching. They can predict certain movements, recognize certain shapes, distinguish between the flickering of one shadow and another. What they have in the cavern passes for knowledge. It functions as knowledge. It allows them to navigate the cavern with reasonable competence. They do not know that it is shadows. Then one of them turns, whether by accident or by something it does not matter to name. One of them turns, and the turning is painful, the joints stiff from long immobility, the fire behind them blinding in a way the shadow never was. The one who is turned cannot immediately see. The brightness is the first experience, and the first experience is not illuminating, it is overwhelming, and the impulse is to turn back. Where the darkness was at least a darkness, the eyes knew how to navigate. But the one who is turned keeps turning, slowly, letting the eyes adjust, and then the fire becomes visible, and the objects before the fire become visible, and the actual shapes of things, the solid three-dimensional reality that the shadows on the wall had been the mere projected surface of, come gradually into a new kind of clarity, still painful, still requiring adjustment, but real in a way the shadows were not. There is an opening at the other end of the cavern. The one who is turned moves toward it, still blinking, and enters a world of light that is again overwhelming, again initially painful, again requiring a long period of adjustment before the eyes can bear it. And gradually, the forms of things in the upper world become visible. Not the fire's imitation of them, not the wall's shadow of them, but the things themselves, standing in full daylight, simply what they are. What Plato was working through in this image was not a story about vision, it was a story about the specific difficulty of genuine knowledge, that it requires turning away from what is comfortable and familiar, that the turning is disorienting in a way that makes it feel like a mistake, and that the person who completes it and then returns to the cavern to report what they found is not thanked. The others are still accustomed to the dark. The returning philosopher, whose eyes have adjusted to sunlight and now struggle again in the dimness, appears to the people in the cavern as someone diminished, someone who went away and came back seeing worse than before. And the things the returning philosopher describes cannot be shown. The upper world cannot be brought down. The philosopher can only say what they saw, and the people in the cavern can only hear it as a claim about shadows they already know, a claim that seems confused, a claim that seems to mistake the familiar dark for something other than it is. Plato did not say this was what had happened to Socrates, but the argument had the shape of what had happened to Socrates, and that shape would have been felt by anyone who had been in the courtroom. What Socrates was doing in the agora, in the way this image frames it, was returning from an upper world and trying to describe it in the language of the cavern. That then he was describing justice not as a social convention, but as something that had a form, a real shape, independent of what the city happened to believe about it at any given moment. He was describing piety not as the performance of the correct rituals, but as something that required genuine understanding, something one could be wrong about in ways that the rituals would not reveal. He was describing courage not as the willingness to charge, but as a quality that could only be named correctly by someone who knew what it was, genuinely for. These descriptions were not comfortable. They implied that the shadows on the wall were shadows. They implied that the city's confident knowledge was something more like a sophisticated familiarity with surfaces. And the people in the cavern, comfortable, competent, having managed their lives reasonably well in the dark, were not positioned to receive this without something that felt like offense. A later thinker, working in Paris in the 20th century, long after the historical distance had made it easier to name what Socrates had been doing, found a word for it. He was interested in a particular kind of speech, not just honest speech, since most people attempt honesty, but speech delivered frankly, fully, without the adjustments that prudence recommends, by someone who has something real to lose by speaking. The word was already old when he used it. Parrhesia. It was a Greek word, and it meant something specific, speaking truly, fully, without softening, without the adjustments that fear recommends, in front of an audience that holds real power over the speaker's life. Not just speaking the truth quietly to a friend, speaking it to 500 men who are about to vote. The reason Parrhesia requires courage in this account is not that the speaker is reckless. It is that the speaker understands the situation completely, knows what the words will cost, knows who is in the room and what they are inclined to do, and chooses the full truth anyway, not in spite of this knowledge, but with it, keeping nothing back. This is not bravery in the mode of a soldier who does not know what is coming. This is something more deliberate and more quiet. The soldier charges because the training has made charging possible. The Parrhesiastes speaks because the commitment to truth has made softening impossible. The commitment came first. The courage followed from it. Standing in an open-air court on a spring morning in 399 BCE, with several hundred citizens waiting for the kind of speech that Athenian defendants customarily gave, the appeals, the weeping relatives, the flattery, The promise to be different, the adjustments of tone and content that any sensible man makes when 500 people are about to vote on whether he lives. Socrates gave the other kind. He gave parousia in its plainest form. He spoke to the jury not as men who held power over him, but as men whose own examined lives were the real subject of the proceeding, and the quality of attention he brought to this, the same quality he brought to every conversation, the same patient, genuine curiosity that had first puzzled and then enraged the people who encountered it in the agora, was in the room of the law court, not a performance. It was simply how he was. He could not give the other kind of speech because the other kind of speech required a kind of self-adjustment that his life had systematically refused for 70 years, and a man of 70 who has never adjusted himself to the room is not going to learn to do it now, in this room, at this hour. The jury noticed. Some of them were angered by it. Some of them were moved in ways they might not have been able to name precisely. A few of them, perhaps, recognized something in the quality of his attention that they had encountered in different forms in their own quieter hours. The recognition that most of what passes for knowledge is not quite knowledge, that most of what passes for certainty is a comfort rather than a fact, that the settled answers to the largest questions are settled in the way that a heavy piece of furniture settles a room, usefully, but without having resolved the question of the room's architecture. What Socrates argued, in the clearest statement of everything his life had been pointing toward, was this: the unexamined life is not worth living. The sentence is short, its brevity is part of its force, but it is not a slogan, and it is not a comfortable observation. It is a precise philosophical claim with real weight and real implications. It is a claim about what conditions human life must meet before it genuinely constitutes a life, rather than a passage of time. There is a Greek distinction, quiet but important, between two senses of a life, between the mere biological duration of existing and something more directed, more formed, more genuinely one's own. Socrates was pointing at the second. He was saying that the second is not delivered automatically by being born, by participating in the city's rituals, by accumulating the conventional forms of success. It requires something that most people do not systematically undertake. It requires turning toward the questions about what is actually good, what is actually just, what is actually worth organizing one's days around, and examining them with genuine care, even when the examination is uncomfortable, even when it produces answers that are less settled than the questions it replaced. This was not a gentle observation. It was delivered in front of 500 people who had just voted to convict him. He was, in this moment, not softening anything for the room's benefit. He was saying that the city that had just found him guilty of corrupting its youth had itself, by refusing the kind of examination he had spent his life embodying, chosen a form of life that was, by his own careful argument, not worth living. He was saying this to the men who were about to decide whether he died. He was saying it quietly, in the same voice he used in the agora, with no more urgency than he brought to a conversation about the craft of pottery. The question his life had always circled, what makes a life genuinely good, genuinely worth the time it takes, was not separable, for Socrates, from the question of how one moves through the world in relation to truth. A life organized around avoiding the difficult question, around maintaining the settled answer, around the comfort of the familiar certainty over the discomfort of genuine inquiry, is not the life of a person who has encountered their own existence honestly. It is the life of someone who has agreed, perhaps without ever making the agreement consciously, to remain in the cavern, not because they are incapable of turning, but because the turning requires something they have not given. The willingness to give it, that is what Socrates called philosophy, not a set of doctrines, not a collection of correct answers to the large questions, not a career, not a set of social habits that mark the philosopher as different from the non-philosopher in visible ways. Simply the willingness to sit with the genuine difficulty of the genuine question, to follow the argument wherever it goes, even when it goes somewhere uncomfortable, to arrive at the recognition of ignorance, not as a failure, but as the ground from which something real might eventually grow. The willingness, in short, to keep the question genuinely open, to refuse the settled answer, not out of contrariness, but out of genuine care for what is actually true. He had done this for 70 years. He was doing it now, in the courtroom, under the specific and serious pressure of a vote that could end him. He was doing it in the same way he had always done it, with the same quality of attention, because a man whose life has been organized around a practice cannot remove that practice from his life in order to save his life without removing the thing that makes his life worth saving. The examined life, the one Socrates claimed was the only kind worth living, cannot be set down temporarily in a courtroom in exchange for an acquittal and picked back up afterward. It is not a habit like a dietary preference. It is a structure. It is the shape of everything. If the question is asked, and it is a real question, one Socrates himself raised and handled with the directness he brought to everything. What does the philosopher stand to lose by stopping, by simply agreeing to be quiet, by accepting exile and keeping the examination private? There is a genuine answer, not a comfortable answer, a genuine one. He would lose the examined life. He would lose the only kind of life that his own philosophy had found worth calling a life. He would survive. He would eat and drink and move through the world and accumulate days. But the specific thing that made the accumulation of days something more than mere duration would be gone. The structure would be broken, and he would know it was broken because he would still understand the argument. The argument about the unexamined life would still be true, still present, still visible to him in its full force, and he would be living in contradiction to it, not in ignorance of it, which is, he seemed to suggest, worse. He had thought about death with the same patient curiosity he brought to everything. In the apology, he offered the jury two possibilities, and he held them both with a steadiness that was not performed. Either death is like a dreamless sleep, a complete cessation of experience, without suffering, without awareness, without anything, in which case there is nothing to fear. A dreamless night is not unpleasant. It simply is not. The person who sleeps does not suffer the absence of experience. There is no person in the sleep to suffer anything. This possibility, looked at honestly and held patiently, loses its terror fairly quickly. The other possibility is that death involves a continuation of something, a going on, a passage into some other state in which the self persists and the conversation can continue. And in that other state, Socrates suggested, there might be something worth looking forward to. The great figures of history, the men and women who had asked the large questions before him, might be encountered there. And if they could be encountered, they could be questioned. If they could be questioned, the examination could continue. If the examination could continue, then death was not the end of philosophy, but a change of venue. This was not consolation. It was not the warm reassurance of someone who needed to be calmed. It was an argument, laid out plainly, with two possibilities both examined, neither dismissed, the listener given time to feel the weight of each before either was accepted or declined. The quality of the argument was characteristically Socratic. not arriving with a conclusion already attached, but following the question until the question yielded whatever it actually had to yield. What it yielded in both cases was the same destination, not because the cases were identical, but because the practice of honest examination had prepared him for either a man who has spent 70 years sitting with difficulty, following arguments past the comfortable stopping point, arriving at the recognition of his own ignorance and finding it not a defeat, but a clearing. This man is not undone by uncertainty about what happens next. He has been living with uncertainty about what happens next his entire life. The uncertainty was always there in every question he asked, in every conversation where the definition fell apart and left two people sitting in the open air without the settled answer they had arrived with. He had survived that uncertainty every time. He had in fact found the survival of it to be the specific thing that made philosophical life what it was. What the agora on an ordinary afternoon had always given him was a question and a person. The person believed they knew something. The question revealed that they knew it less clearly than they had believed. What remained after the belief was loosened and the question stood in its actual form was something quieter and less settled than before, but something more honest, more genuinely in contact with the actual difficulty, more alive to the real shape of the problem. This was not a comfortable gift, but it was a real one, and Socrates, who had given it to the city for decades and received in return the precise resentments he had predicted, seemed to hold the exchange with a steadiness that was the product not of indifference, but of genuine philosophical conviction. The city needed what he was doing more than it needed his silence. The city, large and sluggish and well fed on its confident certainties, needed the small sting of genuine inquiry more than it needed the comfort of having its knowledge confirmed. This was not his arrogance, this was his argument, an argument so carefully made, so honestly arrived at, so consistently embodied in a life lived without contradiction, that even the refutation of it, the vote, the verdict, the sentence, could not quite dislodge it. He had followed the oracle's puzzle all the way to its end. He had set out to disprove it, and had found through the careful accumulation of every disproving attempt that it was true in the only way it could be true, not that he had wisdom, but that he alone had noticed clearly that he lacked it. The recognition of not knowing had become the only honest ground he could find to stand on, and having stood on it long enough, he had found it surprisingly solid, surprisingly restful, in the way that the truth, once genuinely inhabited rather than merely acknowledged, tends to be more restful than the certainty it replaced. A question, followed honestly past the comfortable answer and the comfortable stopping place, past the definition that felt close enough and the argument that almost but not quite holds, arrives eventually at a particular kind of open air. It is not the air of resolution. It is not the air of having arrived somewhere final and settled. It is the air of having followed the question all the way to what the question actually is, stripped of the answers that had been placed over it, standing in its genuine form, making no more demands than a question can make, waiting with the patience of something that has been here always and is in no hurry. Socrates stood in that open air for 70 years. Not knowing was not, for him, the wound it might seem to be. It was the ground on which everything genuine could happen, everything honest could move, everything worth calling philosophy could begin. Not knowing, held honestly, without the cover of a false certainty placed over it to make the day more manageable, this is its own kind of freedom, a quiet one, a freedom not from difficulty, but within it, the freedom of a mind that has stopped defending its conclusions long enough to actually follow its questions, and has found in the following something it did not know how to expect. The afternoon sun lay flat and warm across the open-air court, and Socrates was standing. He had just been convicted. The first vote had been counted, the margin announced, and the courtroom had moved, as Athenian law required it to, into its second phase, the question of penalty. The prosecution had named their preference. Now the convicted man was entitled to name his. Socrates rose in the way he always rose from any surface, without particular haste, without visible agitation, and he began to speak in the same voice he used in the agora on any ordinary morning, the quiet, deliberate voice of a man who has a question and intends to follow it carefully wherever it goes. What the jury was expecting, very probably, was a number, a fine, an offer of exile, some gesture of conciliation that would allow them to close the proceeding with a sentence proportionate to the discomfort the case had already caused. What Socrates offered them instead was a philosophical assessment delivered with apparent sincerity, that the appropriate recognition for his service to Athens was free meals at the Prytaneum, the honor the city reserved for its Olympic victors, its generals returned from great campaigns, its benefactors of exceptional standing. He did not deliver this with a smile or with any audible irony. He said it because it seemed to him, on genuine reflection, to be the honest answer to the question the law had posed. He had spent his life, at considerable personal cost, doing the city a service it had not asked for and had not appreciated. The honest accounting, in his view, produced this result. The room did not respond with laughter. It responded by all surviving indication with something colder, the particular chill of an audience that has been asked to agree with an argument they cannot refute and are not prepared to accept. And then Socrates, apparently understanding that the jury required a number, offered a small fine, so small as to be in its own way another philosophical statement. His friends offered to supplement it. The gesture arrived too late, or too lightly. The second vote was called. The margin for death was wider than the margin for guilt. It is worth staying with that fact for a moment, letting it rest in the mind without hurrying past it. More people voted to execute him than had voted to convict him. The most reasonable interpretation is that his composure, his Prytaneum proposal, and the quality of philosophical challenge he had brought to the entire proceeding had converted some number of jurors who had been inclined toward leniency into votes for the severe penalty. What he had refused to do, diminish himself, accommodate the room, pretend that the proceeding was something other than what he understood it to be, had cost him the distance between a fine and a death sentence. He had understood this possibility. He had chosen the alternative. Plato, who was in the courtroom that day, would spend the rest of his life writing about it. There is a particular quality to Socrates in the days between the verdict and the execution that the dialogues return to carefully, and it is worth inhabiting slowly. The execution was delayed. A religious festival required that a sacred ship complete its voyage before the city could carry out a capital sentence, and so Socrates had several weeks in which to demonstrate whether the positions he had defended in court were the positions he actually held, or whether, in the privacy of a prison cell, in the proximity of death, the philosophy would prove to have been a performance. His friends arranged for his escape. The plan was in place, the guards were approachable, the money was ready. Crito, one of his oldest and most devoted friends, came to the prison before dawn and sat beside the sleeping Socrates and waited. He waited a long time. Socrates slept easily and deeply in the way of a man who has arranged his interior life to produce that result. When he woke, Crito told him about the escape. He told him the plan was solid, that there would be no serious difficulty, that people in other cities were ready to receive them, and that Socrates' friends had already considered the logistics. He told Socrates that public opinion would not look well on people who had let their friend die when they had the means to prevent it. He told him that it was possible to go and that the path was clear. Socrates considered this with the same patient attention he brought to every problem presented to him. He asked whether the escape would be just, not safe, not practical, not comfortable, just. He asked whether the opinion of the majority, which Crito had mentioned, was the kind of opinion that should carry weight in the determination of right action, or whether only the opinion of the knowledgeable and the wise had genuine authority in ethical questions. He had asked this question before in other circumstances in the agora with other people. The method was the same. The situation was different only in the magnitude of what the answer implied. The argument Socrates made to Crito in that prison, as Plato has preserved it, is one of the most concentrated philosophical refusals in the written record. He had lived for 70 years under the laws of Athens. He had raised his children under them, benefited from their protections, built his life within the structure they maintained. He had had opportunities to leave Athens and had not taken them. His continued residence was, he argued, an implicit agreement, a lifelong endorsement of the city's legal authority, an acceptance of the terms. To break that agreement, now specifically when the agreement became costly to him personally, would be to reveal that his fidelity to the law had always been conditional, that his celebrated consistency was in fact available for purchase at the right price. The laws, in his imagination, spoke to him directly. They reminded him that he had always been free to go, that the city had never forced him to stay, that his presence for 7 decades amounted to consent. To flee now would be to harm the very structure that had made his philosophical life possible, and it would contradict in a single night everything his life of argument had built. He would not do it. The argument is not beyond challenge. Philosophers have examined it carefully for centuries and found the places where it strains. The analogy between a contract and a life lived in a particular city has limits. Consent given by a person who had no practical alternative to staying is a complicated thing to call free. These difficulties are real, and Socrates was certainly capable of recognizing them. But the argument he made was not only a legal argument, it was a demonstration. He was showing what it looked like to actually hold a philosophy rather than to profess it, to carry the reasoning into the domain where it cost something, and to find it still standing. Crito, by all accounts, sat in the prison and could not find an answer to it. On the last morning, Socrates' friends gathered in the cell, and what Plato describes in the Phaedo is a scene of sustained philosophical conversation interrupted by grief, or rather, a scene in which the grief keeps arriving and being acknowledged, and then set carefully aside in favor of continuing the argument. Socrates was discussing the soul. He was asking, with genuine curiosity, what reasons there were to believe it persisted after the body ended, and what reasons there were to believe it did not, and what the honest tally of those reasons produced. He was not performing equanimity. He was following a question. His friends wept. He noticed. He remarked, with a gentleness that was not condescension, that a philosopher who had spent his entire life working toward the conclusion that the soul was more real and more valuable than the body, and who collapsed into grief at the moment when that proposition was going to be tested, would have to admit that his life had been a kind of theater, that the philosophy had not reached all the way down, had not become the substance of the man, but remained instead a set of positions held at a comfortable remove from their implications. He did not say this cruelly. He said it in the way of someone pointing at a logical consequence. He also said, with equal honesty, that he was not certain. He was not certain the soul persisted. He was not certain about the nature of whatever came after. He held his best arguments with the same calibrated confidence he brought to everything, firmly enough to act on them, openly enough to revise them if a better argument arrived. The certainty he had was not the certainty of a man who has found the answer. It was the certainty of a man who has looked at the question as carefully as he knows how and found the best available position, and who is willing, even now, even here, to be shown that he has missed something. The jailer came in the afternoon. He apologized, with what seems to have been genuine feeling, for the task he was required to perform. Socrates thanked him. The hemlock was prepared and brought, and Socrates received it from the jailer's hands with steadiness, not the performed steadiness of a man mastering his fear, but the natural steadiness of a man who has been moving toward this moment for 70 years and finds it, on arrival, continuous with everything that preceded it. He held the cup for a moment, not long, then he drank. His friends were in pieces. Plato was not present. He records that he was ill, but he preserved what the others told him, and what they told him was that Socrates, in his last minutes, was still following the argument, still present to it, still finding in the practice of careful thought, right to the edge of everything, the thing he had always found in it, not peace as an absence of difficulty, but peace as the particular quality of attention that comes when a mind has stopped fighting the question and simply settled into it. What Socrates had understood, and what the long decades of his philosophical life had made available to him, was that the two great human strategies for managing death, the religious assurance and the philosophical argument, were not as different in their practical result as they appeared. Both, at their most serious, produced the same orientation, the willingness to hold one's life lightly enough that its ending did not require a revision of everything it had meant. The difference was in the method. Socrates could not simply believe. He could only follow the argument, carefully, honestly, wherever it went, and trust that wherever it went was where he needed to be. The argument, that last afternoon went all the way to the end. Hannah Arendt, sitting in her own later century with the debris of a different catastrophe around her, came back to Socrates repeatedly when she was trying to understand what had gone wrong. She had watched ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil, and the question she kept returning to was not the question of malice. Malice she could account for, but the question of the people who had simply stopped thinking, who had accepted the frameworks presented to them, operated within the assumptions available, never pressed against the edges of what they were told was true. She described what was required, what Socrates had been doing his whole life in every conversation in the agora, as thinking without a banister. The image is exact, a staircase with no railing, each step taken with full attention, because there is nothing to grab if the foot slips. No established framework to lean on, no authoritative conclusion to defer to. Just the question and the next careful step and the honest assessment of where the step has landed. The people in the cave, in Plato's great image from the Republic, are not cruel. They are not malicious. They are simply people who have never had occasion to turn around. The firelight is behind them, casting shadows on the wall ahead, and the shadows are all they have seen, and it has not occurred to them to doubt that the shadows are the whole of what there is to see. The philosopher, the one who has been outside, who has seen actual light and come back to report it, arrives not as a conqueror, but as a disturbance, something that makes the shadows look different. something that asks the prisoners to consider whether what they have always taken for solid and certain might be a projection of something else, something they have not yet turned to look at. The prisoners, in Plato's account, would kill the returning philosopher if they could. Socrates was the returning philosopher. He had understood this for a long time. In the Apology, describing himself as a gadfly, the insect that stings a large slow horse into waking, he was not complaining. He was explaining. A horse that is never stung remains asleep in the afternoon sun, which is comfortable for the horse, and which does not serve the horse. The sting is unpleasant, and the horse does not want it, and if the horse could prevent it, the horse certainly would. None of this means the sting is wrong. None of this means the horse is wrong to resist it. It means only that the function of the sting and the desire of the horse are genuinely, irreducibly in conflict, and that this conflict is not a failure anyone has made, but a structural feature of the situation. Athens had needed the gadfly. Athens had killed it. Both things were true, and neither canceled the other. The question that Socrates' trial and death raised, and which remains exactly as open now as it was in 399 BCE, is whether any city, organized on any principles, can sustain the presence of genuine philosophical truth-telling inside its own public life. Not the decorative version, the philosophy that confirms what the city already believes and gives it an elegant language in which to do so. The real version, the kind that asks a celebrated general, returning in triumph, to sit for 20 minutes and try to explain what courage actually is, and that does not let him leave until they have both acknowledged that his answer does not hold. The kind that approaches a respected poet in the agora and asks what the poem means, and pursues the question until the poet has admitted, not without distress, that he cannot say. The kind that makes a juror feel, while listening to the defense, that the real subject of this proceeding is not the man standing before them, but the quality of their own examined lives. Athens was a democracy. It had, among all ancient political arrangements, the highest commitment to reason, to deliberation, to the public testing of ideas against the responses of an informed citizenry. It was the city most likely to be able to sustain the presence of a Socrates. It was the city that voted, by a margin of 59, to execute him. This is not an argument against democracy. It is an argument about something harder and more durable, about the structural tension between the comfort of established belief and the discomfort of honest inquiry, which is not specific to any political form. Every arrangement of communal life that has ever existed has found this tension unresolvable. Every community has wanted the fruits of honest thought, better decisions, genuine knowledge, the capacity to recognize error before it metastasizes, and every community has found the process by which those fruits are produced to be, at close range, unbearable. The fruit and the process are the same thing. Socrates could not give Athens the first without the second. He had tried for decades. The agora had shown him over and over what the honest investigation of civic certainties produced in the people who held them. He had not stopped. There is a fragment of the Apology that carries in its compressed plainness the weight of everything Socrates had spent his life arguing, and it arrives not at the beginning of the speech, when the jury was still open, but near its end, after the conviction, in the part of the proceeding where he was already speaking to men who had decided against him. He told them that they could kill him, and that this would settle nothing, and that other gadflies would come, because the question did not die with the person who was asking it. He told them that a young man of 35, watching from somewhere in the jury today, might spend the rest of his life turning the trial's questions over. He told them, without bitterness and without consolation, that the question simply continued past the individual asking it, past the city that had attempted to silence it, past any particular afternoon in any particular open-air court. Plato, who may have been 35 in that courtroom, spent the next 50 years writing. What he wrote is not a simple preservation of what Socrates said. It is something more complicated, a philosophical monument built around a man whose central philosophical commitment was that philosophy could not be monumentalized. Socrates had refused to write anything. He had worked in conversation, in the living exchange, in the elenchus, the cross-examination that required two people and a genuine question, and the willingness on both sides to follow the logic wherever it went. Plato put this method into written dialogues, which is a kind of paradox, and the best argument that it is not quite a contradiction is that the dialogues work, that reading the Apology, or the Phaedo, or the Credo, at a careful pace still produces something like the experience Socrates was trying to create. The moment when an apparently settled answer begins to loosen, when the confident reply reveals its own fault lines, when the question opens rather than closes. Plato sat at a writing table years after the execution, the city more or less the same city it had been, the agora still full of the same kinds of people, pursuing the same kinds of certainties, and he tried to hold in language the specific quality of attention that Socrates had brought to every room he walked into. Not just the arguments could be reported, but the patience in them, the genuine curiosity. The thing that made a man who came to the agora to buy fish stay for 2 hours, trying to define justice instead, and walk away troubled in a way that was somehow obscurely better than the untroubled state he had arrived in. Plato knew that what he was trying to preserve was by its nature unpreservable. He wrote it down anyway. The document survived. Everything else in 4th century Athens, the colonnades, the marketplaces, the particular quality of a morning in the agora with the smoke from a nearby sacrifice drifting across the open square, is gone. What remains is the voice on the page asking the question, and the question itself has a quality that is worth resting in for a moment. Here at the end of this long day, with the details of the trial and the cell and the hemlock cup beginning to soften and recede, the question Socrates was asking was not a single question. It was more like a disposition, a particular orientation toward the contents of one's own mind, a refusal to let any answer settle permanently into unexamined certainty. The question of what justice is, the question of what courage is, the question of what it means to live well rather than merely to live long. These questions do not, on honest examination, produce agreed answers. They have not produced agreed answers in 2,500 years of sustained philosophical attention. This is not, on reflection, evidence of failure. It may be evidence that the questions are pointing at something real and genuinely difficult, something that repays exactly the kind of patient, non-anxious attention that Socrates modeled by example in every conversation he ever had. The examined life is not a comfortable life. Socrates was not comfortable in the material sense, and he had not been comfortable in the philosophical sense since the oracle's declaration had sent him out into the agora to find someone wiser than himself. What he had found over decades of looking was something that was not comfort, but was in some ways better, the steady, unagitated quality of a mind that has stopped pretending, that has laid down the effort of maintaining certainties it cannot actually justify, that has found in the honest acknowledgement of its own limits not defeat, but a kind of spaciousness, a room that is unexpectedly large once the furniture of false knowledge has been cleared away. He had described this to his friends on the last afternoon. He had described it calmly, with the philosophical precision he brought to everything, as though he were reporting on a region he had spent years exploring and found habitable, even pleasant, in its particular way. His friends had wept. He had continued the argument. These two things, the grief of the people watching and the equanimity of the man at the center, were not in conflict. They were both honest responses to the same event, registered from different distances. The friends were losing something irreplaceable. Socrates was completing something he had been building for 70 years, one careful conversation at a time. Outside the prison, the city continued. The harbor was still there, with its smell of salt and timber. The agora was still there, the stalls being set up in the early morning by merchants who had not heard or had heard and had moved on, because a city does not pause for long around any particular grief. The Parthenon still stood above the city, visible from below on clear days, its presence unchanged. The assembly bell would ring again tomorrow, calling citizens to a meeting. The conversations in the agora would resume, different conversations, with different people, over different questions, but shaped in ways that were difficult to measure by the 70 years of philosophical disturbance that Socrates had introduced into that particular square of Athenian stone. What he had left behind was not a doctrine. He had been very careful about that. He had never written a treatise, never established a school, never produced a systematic account of the truth as he understood it, that his followers could memorize and recite. What he had left behind was a practice, the practice of the honest question, the patient conversation, the willingness to follow an argument into the places where it became uncomfortable, and to stay there, looking rather than retreating into the simpler territory of confident assertion. He had left behind the demonstration of what it looked like to actually hold a philosophical position all the way down, through every test, including the final one. The practice did not die with him. It could not. A practice is not a person. It is a way of doing something, and it persists as long as there are people willing to do it, willing to stop in the middle of their day and ask whether the thing they are most certain of can survive a careful second look. Plato did it in writing. Aristotle, who was not yet born when Socrates died, would do it in a different key. Later philosophers in other cities and other centuries, working in languages Socrates had never heard, would find themselves doing something recognizably similar, sitting with a difficult question long enough to discover that it was more difficult than they had initially believed, and then sitting longer and finding in the continued sitting not frustration, but something oddly restful, the question becoming familiar, becoming almost companionable, losing the sharp edge of threat it had carried when it was new. This is the practical inheritance of the examined life, not the answers, the questions held steadily enough to become a kind of company. In the prison, as the afternoon light shifted and the shadows moved across the stone floor, Socrates drank from the cup and then walked around the cell for a while, as the jailer had recommended, a practical instruction for the poison's even distribution, and then lay down and let the coldness move through him in its slow, deliberate way, from the feet upward, and continued for as long as he could to follow the thread of the argument he had been tracking. His friends were in the room. Some of them could not look, others could not look away. Plato was elsewhere, ill, and spent the rest of his life working with the material that other people brought him from. That afternoon, the reports of what was said and how Socrates had been, and what the quality of presence in the room was, and whether there had been anything in the manner of the man's dying that could be preserved in language and given to people who had not been there. There had been. That is the improbable and enduring fact. Something of the quality of that afternoon is still available to a careful reader, sitting anywhere in the world, in any century, in a translation of a document written in a language that is no longer spoken by anyone's mother. The words on the page still do the thing they were written to do. The argument still opens the question rather than closing it. The voice still carries, across the enormous distance of 2,500 years, that specific quality of patient, unperformed, genuinely curious attention to whatever question the present moment is raising. It is not a dramatic quality. It was never a dramatic quality. Socrates was not a dramatic person in the sense that drama requires the performance of heightened feeling for an audience. He was simply someone who had found, through long practice, that the honest question was the most interesting thing available in any room, and who could not resist following it, and who did not find that this requirement made his life burdensome. Even at the end, especially at the end, the argument was still there. The question was still open. There was still something to find out, or at least something to look for. And the looking was the thing. The looking was always the thing, not the finding. The light in the cell that afternoon was the kind of light that falls through small, high windows in stone buildings, a shaft of it crossing the floor in an angle that would have moved slowly, predictably, over the hours, the way all light moves when there is nothing to interrupt it. His friends were gathered. The argument was in progress. The hemlock was doing what the hemlock did, and Socrates, by all available account, was not elsewhere. He was entirely present to the moment, to the question, to the conversation still unfinished, the way he had been present to every conversation in the agora on every morning of a long life spent in exactly this way. The question he had carried for 70 years, not any particular question about justice or piety or courage, but the deeper one, the one underneath all the others, about what it means to examine a life rather than simply to live it. That question did not end with the man who was asking it. It had been here before him in different forms, in different languages, asked by different people who had found themselves unable to rest in an unexamined certainty and had therefore kept pressing, carefully, at the edges of what they knew. It would be here afterward. It is here now, in whatever quality of stillness this particular hour contains, in the way that some questions simply persist, not demanding anything, not requiring resolution, but remaining available to whoever is willing to sit quietly enough, long enough, to feel the shape of them. The conversation has not ended.